All right, guys. So previously we were looking at this question to do with fluoridation in water and how it can have positive impacts on dental hygiene and how this might not be the case because of the experiences of one of these campaign leaders. Hopefully, guys, this question was exemplary of how to approach an assumptions question, and hopefully, guys, many of you were able to get that correct with or without help. Now, guys, we're going to move on to the next question, which is question 10. So let's read this together. So it says, climate scientists in Greenland studying patterns of plant growth have suggested that the early arrival of spring in the Arctic threatens to drive down populations of migrating animals, such as the caribou. However, comparable studies elsewhere show that their fears are unfounded. A recent study of great tits in Oxfordshire showed that birds are capable of adapting to climate change better than many scientists expected. Over the past half century, the birds have brought forward the date they lay their eggs by 2 weeks so that the young are born when plant-eating grubs are most plentiful. Then it says, which of the following is an underlying assumption of the above argument? So guys, pause the video, just give yourself over a minute and be sure to be back after that where we're going to go over the solutions. All right, guys, so welcome back. So hopefully you have some time to get an answer. So let's go through this. Remember, the aim, guys, here is that we want to find the conclusion and have at the back of our head the reasons. So climate scientists agree and study patterns of plant growth suggests that the early arrival of spring in the Arctic threatens to drive down populations of migratory animals such as the caribou. So that's clearly just it's someone else's opinion, but remember, we treat that as a fact. So this, guys, we can cross this all out. So this is all going to be crossed out. Then it says, however, comparable studies also show that their fears are unfounded. So this is clearly his opinion, isn't it? So we're going to bracket this off as an opinion. And then it says a recent study. So remember, whenever you see study or research, words along these lines is pointing you towards a fact. But let's just read it. A recent study of greatest in Oxfordshire show that the birds are capable of adapting to climate change better than many scientists expected. So that's clearly just all going to be fact. And then it says, over the past half century, the birds have brought forward the date that they lay their eggs by 2 weeks so that the young are born when plant-eating grubs are most plentiful. Again, that's just still fact. So you can cross that off. So that goes off like that. So therefore, guys, hopefully you can see that basically the conclusion is that the fears that the climate change in the Greenland is going to affect the populations. It shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be true. And basically, some of the reasons he's given is this case study in Oxfordshire of the great tits, essentially. So let's go through the answers step by step. So the first one, migrating animals in the Arctic can adapt to climate change as successfully as the great tits in Oxfordshire. So that one I think is actually a good option because he's basing his reasoning based on a completely different population. So clearly he's assuming that the population he's talking about, the Greenland, is they can adapt as well as these people in these great tits in Oxfordshire. I think that's a really good option. So you can bracket that off. The second one, birds are more adaptable than large animals such as the caribou. This one, if that was even if that was the case, that would technically be against what he's trying to say because he's trying to say that you shouldn't worry because birds. He's basically assuming, as we can see in the part A, he's assuming that birds and the populations in the Greenlands are the same. But if birds were more adaptable, then his whole argument would be flawed. So it can't be this one. Unless animals like the caribou produce their young early in the year, their population would fall. So that sounds more like a conclusion, definitely not an assumption, and it's not linked in any way to the passage. Remember, in these assumptions questions, guys, also think about it. Does this answer option link in any way to the passage? If it doesn't, you can exclude it immediately, right? And then the next one, the scientists working also have great expertise than those working in Greenland. Um, I mean, you could consider that, but it's not definitely not going to be as strong as A. And if they did have either way, if they did have more expertise, then A kind of is irrelevant. But if they did have um, more expertise, then that would suggest that more research has to be done. More research has to be done in the Greenland areas for us to even come up with this conclusion. So this is just pretty random. So you can just cross this out. Option E: climate change in Greenland and climate change in Oxford are of the same scale. So this one over here, I mean, you can consider it because if the if the climate change, is of the same scale, then that might suggest, the Greenland populations might be able to adapt as well. However, this is more talking rather than talking about the scale of the. This is why you have to understand the basis of the argument. Rather than talking about the scale of the climate change, is more talking about the adaptability of the organisms. Hence, why A is a much better answer option, even if you were to consider this. So this one's going to be X as well, and therefore, hopefully, guys, you can understand that A is going to be your correct answer. So, guys, basically, what we learned over here is that make sure that the answer option links in some way. Is it relevant to the passage in any way? Then you can start considering it. Okay, is it going to be an assumption? Is it a candidate for an assumption? And then sometimes you might get two or three possible assumptions, and then you're basically trying to pick the most strong one. Okay, so that's hopefully that's made sense, guys. And as always, we look forward to seeing you in the next video. All right, guys. So welcome back. So previously we were looking at this question to do with climate change, the green, and how it's going to affect its population, and how this shouldn't be founded. Hopefully, guys, that made sense, and we learned a lot of skills of how to tackle these assumption questions. Now, guys, we're going to move on to the next set of questions, which is coming from the IMAT 2014. So let's read this together. So it says, when driving, if the car in front of you brakes suddenly, you need to be able to stop without crashing into it. The easy rule of thumb is a 2-second rule. You should choose a reference point that the vehicle in front of you is passing, then say aloud, only a fool breaks a 2-second rule. If you reach the reference point before you have finished saying you need to pull back, this works at all speeds. However, when there are adverse road conditions or the road is narrow, you need to double your braking distance. These practices will enable you to avoid such crashes. And then it says, which of the following is an underlying assumption of the argument? So guys, pause the video, give yourself just over a minute. Be sure to be back after that, where we're going to go through the solutions. All right, guys, so welcome back. So let's go through this. So remember, we need to look for the conclusion. So it says, when driving, if the car in front of you brakes suddenly, you need to be able to stop without crashing into it. That's pretty self-explanatory, and that's therefore just all going to be fact. So you can just cross that all out as fact. And then it says the easiest rule of thumb is the 2-second rule. That's kind of his opinion. I might not necessarily agree with that, so that's why I'm going to bracket this off. And it says you choose a reference point that the vehicle in front of you is passing, then say aloud, only a fool breaks the 2-second rule. So that's clear. He just explained what the rules are of the 2-second rule. So that's just going to be fact. So we can just cross this all out as fact. And then it says if you reach the reference point before you finish saying you need to pull back. Again, it's just carrying on with the rules. Therefore, that's going to be fact. This works at all speeds. I mean, yeah, you can kind of think that's his. Let's just put it down as his opinion. So this is kind of also his opinion. Then it says, however, when you're in the adverse road conditions or the road is narrow, you should double your braking distance. So that's just, again, talking about the rules. So we can just cross that all out. And then the last sentence, these practices will enable you to avoid such crashes. That's clearly his opinion as well. So in total, if you kind of accumulate those three bracketed sentences, he's really trying to say if you follow this 2-second rule, it would help you to avoid crashes. And some of the reasons is there's not really reasoning behind it, but he's just explaining to you, he or she just explaining to you the practicalities of how the 2-second rule works, and is basically trying to put forward the fact that it basically works and will therefore avoid crashes, which is the conclusion. So which of the following is an assumption? The first one, adopting the 2-second rule would avoid all accidents. So this one isn't really even an assumption. This is more like a conclusion. That's why this is another skill, guys, you'll build along the way. A is more of like a conclusion. And even if this was a conclusion question, it won't be the conclusion anyway, because it's a pretty bold statement. He's just saying, hey, it would help you to avoid crashes. He's not saying you would avoid them completely, every single accident, but it will just help you, right? So there's no guarantees here. So that's why it can't be that one. Most crashes are caused by cars running into the car in front. Remember, guys, this is totally relevant. It doesn't link in any way to the passage, so it definitely can't be this. This is just fully out of context. Those who don't use the rule do not value road safety. Again, nowhere in the passages that talk about that, guys. It's just plain irrelevant, so you can cross that out. D, some drivers brake more suddenly. Some drivers brake more suddenly than others. Again, like even you might say, okay, this is kind of relevant to the passage, but even if you, another way, guys, you can remember, I think we've done this in some of the previous questions, is formulate a sentence. So following the 2-second rule would enable you to avoid crashes, assuming that some drivers brake more suddenly than others. That doesn't make sense, does it? So remember, if you formulate the assumption into a sentence with the conclusion and it doesn't make sense, that's pretty strong evidence that that's not going to be the assumption. So it can't be this one. So by elimination, relatively, the last one, E, but let's check it anyway. It will not take less than 2 seconds to repeat the saying. It will not take less than 2 seconds to repeat the saying. So yeah, this was actually quite good, because obviously if it takes you less than 2 seconds to say the phrase, only a fool. So I'm talking about this part over here, only a fool. So if it takes you less than 2 seconds to say that, then obviously the whole thing is flawed, and therefore the 2-second rule wouldn't work. And so you're basically assuming that it takes you exactly 2 seconds to say that. So that's why E is actually a very good option in this case. You kind of have to think out, but it's definitely relevant over here, because it's, remember, here it's talking about the 2-second rule, and in the passage it's also talking about the 2-second rule. That's what makes it relevant. And therefore, that's why I'm saying E is going to be the correct one, and E is going to be our winner in this case. So hopefully, guys, that has made sense. And as always, we look forward to seeing you in the next video. All right, guys, so welcome back. So previously, we were looking at this question to do with the 2-second rule. It was a bit of an abstract paragraph because it's not really clear, which is distinctively the reasoning and which is distinctively the conclusion. But hopefully, guys, with practice, this will all come along in due time, and hopefully my explanation has made sense. But now, guys, without further ado, we move on to the next question, question 18 of the same paper. So it says, a smoking cigarette causes a speeding up in the rate of blood flow, which in turn increases the risk of heart disease. Then it says, it was thought that this speeding up of blood flow was caused solely by the gas carbon monoxide, which is absorbed during smoking, and not by nicotine, which is also absorbed from the smoke in the lungs. Then it says, however, tests have shown that using nicotine patches, from which nicotine is absorbed through the skin, when chewing nicotine gum, also causes the rate of blood flow to increase. This shows that nicotine in the cigarettes is also responsible for the increased risk of heart disease among smokers. And which of the following is not an assumption of the argument in the passage above? So guys, pause the video, give yourself just over a minute. Be sure to be back after that, where we're going to go over the solutions. All right, guys, so welcome back. So let's go through this. So smoking cigarette causes a speeding up in the rate of blood, which in turn increases the risk of heart disease. So that's clearly just a fact, isn't it? So we can cross this all out as fact. Then it says, it was thought that the speeding up of blood was caused solely by the gas carbon monoxide, which is absorbed during smoking, and not by nicotine, which is also absorbed from the smoke in the lungs. So this is clearly someone else's opinion. Remember, we treat someone else's opinion as a fact. So we can just cross this all out. So let's just cross this all out. Then it says, however, tests have shown that using nicotine patches or chewing nicotine gum also causes rate of blood flow to increase. So that's just explaining the results of a test they did, isn't it? So that's just going to be observation, and that's therefore going to all just be fact. Then it says, this shows that nicotine in cigarettes is also responsible for the increased risk of heart disease among smokers. That's clearly just their opinion, isn't it? And this is a classic passage, guys, where they give a bunch of reasoning, like data, evidence, research, blah, blah, and then they come up with a conclusion at the end. So the conclusion here is that nicotine is also responsible for the increase of heart disease, and some of the evidence is that when you give nicotine patches or nicotine chewing gum, that also increases the rate of blood flow, which is known to increase the risk of heart disease. So let's go through the option. It says, which of the following is not an assumption? So this is actually the opposite, guys. So 4 of them are going to be assumptions, and 1 of them is not going to be an assumption. Okay, so let's look at, let's start with A. Any difference between the amount of nicotine absorbed from smoking and the amount of absorbed from and chewing gum can be, can be disregarded. Yeah, so that's clearly going to be an assumption here, guys, isn't it? Because you're assuming that in those tests where they use nicotine patches and nicotine gum, you're basically assuming that the amount of nicotine you get from there, the amount of nicotine you get from smoking is basically comparable. So that's going to be an assumption, isn't it? So this one is an assumption, therefore it's not going to be the answer. B, carbon dioxide is not absorbed from nicotine patches and nicotine chewing gum. So that's an assumption, isn't it, guys? So you're assuming in the nicotine patches and the nicotine chewing gum that there's no carbon monoxide at all. You're only assuming it's pure nicotine, and therefore, if there was any carbon monoxide, you can't come up with any conclusion then, right? So that's an assumption you're making, definitely. So it can't be this one. And then the next one, carbon dioxide would not produce a rise in the rate of blood flow in the absence of nicotine. So that's just kind of random, guys. It doesn't. So here it's saying carbon monoxide would not produce a rise in. So here is basically trying to say carbon monoxide is dependent on nicotine, but that doesn't link in any way to what the paragraph is saying. So I'm pretty confident this is not going to be an assumption. But let's just go through all of them. This is quite irrelevant. Then the next one, the effect of nicotine on the body does not depend on the way in which it was absorbed. So obviously that's an assumption you're making, because in the test it's going through the skin, which we see here, and it's also another way they're doing it is through the gum, so orally, right? So you're assuming the way you take it in, for example, when you're smoking it through the lungs, you're assuming that it all has the same effect. You're all assuming it's representative of what's actually going to happen when you smoke cigarettes. So this is going to be an assumption, therefore. If you look at the last one, there's nothing else in nicotine patches and chewing gum which might cause an increase in rate of blood flow. Again, you're assuming that, isn't it? You're assuming that maybe, for example, you never know, like in the nicotine patch, maybe the plastic, for example, might be increasing rate of blood flow. You're assuming the whole effect is due to nicotine. So this is going to be an assumption as well. So hopefully, guys, it was pretty clear then that even if you weren't considering C is quite blatantly going to be the assumption here, because the other ones, we quite nicely proved that they're all assumptions of this passage. So hopefully, guys, that's made sense. And as always, we look forward to seeing you in the next video.